Vítejte v Saleshero Podcastu, kde měníme pohled na prodej. Přidejte se k nám na zajímavé rozhovory, nové poznatky a inspiraci pro váš biznis. Moderují Alexandr Rajman a Fares Měchura ze Saleshero, prvního českého sales podcastu plného užitečných rad a zkušeností. Více informací najdete na www.saleshero.cz. Připravte se odhalit svůj prodejní potenciál a pusťte se do toho.
Vítejte u dnešní epizody. Rádi bychom vás upozornili na to, že tento díl bude v angličtině. Věříme, že to pro vás bude fajn příležitost si procvičit jazyk a načerpat nové informace. Now, let's jump into today's episode with our guest, Jan Matthew Pochop, founder and CEO of Pochop Presentation. Jan is passionate about storytelling, structure, and yes, PowerPoint. Outside of work, he's into guitar, mountain biking, rock climbing, and cold plunges after the sauna. And today we're gonna help you, founders and owners of businesses and salespeople, to learn more about storytelling and how it can accelerate your sales. Enjoy.
Hey, Jan, welcome.
Hey, Fares. Thank you for inviting me here. I'm looking forward to the talk.
Jan, when I did this preparation, I saw that you're into a guitar. You're playing a guitar. What kind of genre you're playing?
I play classical guitar.
Wow.
Yeah. I grew up with it. So I started when I was around 8 years old. And at the time, I was quite a nervous kid. I'm an introvert, and I had a hard time relaxing. And my guitar teacher at the time, he helped me kind of open up in a sense and relax, because you have to be relaxed to play the instrument. To even play a few notes, you kind of relax your hands, relax your body. And even if you're nervous, you still have to kind of physically relax. And I ended up playing I play even now, but I ended up playing at university level with guitar majors and won some competitions, and got pretty serious at one point, but not serious enough that I would take it as a career.
So you're a professional guitar player?
I would say like an amateur.
Oh, okay. Yeah. You and I have other ideas of what an amateur is.
I did try to enter some competitions when I was like around 17 or so, and I did not fare that well. But I would say that now as an adult, even though I don't play so many pieces, my level is even higher than it was at my best.
Oh, okay.
Because I don't know if you've noticed this, but as you age, you become more attuned to detail.
Yes.
Your hearing improves and stuff. So the pieces that I still play, I've played them thousands of times, and it's just like I can notice every single note and play them just the way I like. So there's a
mastery.
There's a mastery, exactly.
Such a nice story. I always envy people that had the chance to learn and play an instrument. And as I'm saying, like I never had the chance to learn an instrument, but therefore I became a DJ.
I was very lucky that my parents kind of forced us kids to stick with it. You know, they're like, once we chose, then we couldn't quit till we were 18, essentially. And
good.
It was like an hour a day of practicing every day for, age of 18. And then after that, it was like 2 hours a day.
Brilliant. So. Brilliant. But this is a very nice story that leads me actually to start today's episode. Today is all about putting a story into a presentation. So why do you think a story is important to be in a presentation?
Nowadays, or actually at any point in history, but especially nowadays, we're surrounded with noise and surrounded with information, right? And it's really, really difficult to stand out. And stories are the way that we've communicated for thousands of years. It's like rooted in our history, and it's actually related to the way our brains work, in fact. So when we have a problem or a solution or something put in terms of a logical flow, which I would call story, then our brains can latch onto it, understand it, and retain it much more easily.
That's very interesting that actually our brain evolved to understand stories. So why are so many people nowadays going without a story?
Okay, well, I would say that it's sometimes the application of storytelling, of creating the logic, takes a lot of effort. You have to sit down with the things that you're working on. You have to think about what the audience wants to hear. You have to make it in the context of your audience, right? Just like you would in sales. And I believe that takes a lot of effort. But just putting your message out there and just, that's much easier.
Yeah, but especially into the B2B world, I mean, we've seen, let's say, lots of CEOs, founders, co-founders, or even, let's say, sales managers, when they go out there and pitch, they're preparing a deck, right?
Yeah.
And usually that's like a dry presentation. There is no story. So can you elaborate more about these differences between dry and, a story?
Absolutely. A lot of times when we're in a job or a role where we become experts, we end up understanding the detail really, really deeply. And then we get to a point where we want to explain that detail to everyone. And we also get very excited about, let's say, the company we're working for and how great it is. And sometimes we forget to take the perspective of a person who knows nothing about us and take that perspective of why they should listen. And just because you're in the room doesn't necessarily mean that your audience is immediately going to get what you're talking about if you just dive straight into the detail. So I feel like what would be a dry presentation is, no matter how interesting the topic is, if you don't make it relevant for the audience. Mm-hmm. And that's the very first step in building a story.
And what you said, we are programmed to latch on to stories. So what are the universal elements of a good story? Is there an algorithm? Is there a universal structure that we latch on to?
I would say yes, there is, to a certain extent. And it's quite simple in theory, let's say.
Okay. In theory.
In theory, yeah. The practice of it is a little bit more tricky. And the structure that I tend to follow, which is very similar to how we've built stories. It's very similar actually to how maybe Steve Jobs does a keynote, but I'm thinking of a particular framework that I'll just go back a little bit around it, is that I was mentioning that we had those stories from caveman times, and there's a the roots of what we use today is from Socratic thinking from the ancient Greeks. And in the 1970s, there was a woman named Barbara Minto, and she worked at McKinsey, and she developed this method of what we call logic and structure in thinking, writing, and presenting. And that's became the basis of how management consultants make presentations, which I believe they are actually some of the best storytellers in the business world for these types of presentations, when you're trying to persuade someone, or trying to necessarily persuade, but trying to get someone to take an action. And the framework that she uses, and that I use in a lot of my work, is quite simple in the sense that you essentially want to get people on the same page. So first you need to describe a situation, essentially optimally a situation that everyone is familiar with, that everyone knows, so we're on the same page. Then you introduce a change in that situation, and that could either go negative or positive. So it could be a problem that has occurred, a change in the market, an issue, or it could be, hey, there's a new opportunity. There's something we haven't looked at yet. And from that change comes an implicit question, what can we do about it? And to that you bring your answer. And then you would break down your answer in certain levels, which is where the logic structure comes in. But in most cases, my clients know the solution and they know a lot about themselves, but they don't go to those higher levels to understand the problem and the situation.
So it's like an appetizer. Before you serve the main course, you have to prime the audience a little bit.
Yeah, that's an interesting
situation, problem. Okay.
Correct, yeah.
Excellent. It's a very interesting recipe that also me and Alex were discussing with our clients and to the audience here on the podcast. When you start a presentation, always start, with the situation, in what situation the company is, right?
Absolutely.
Or, for example, when a co-founders, they go out there and pitch in front of the investors, they focus immediately, hey, this is like who we are, what kind of an experience we have as a team, then this is our product. And they're liking the other story. Instead of, starting, this is the situation in the world. These are the problems that the world is facing. Therefore, we came out with this kind of solution that will tackle these XYZ problems, right?
Exactly. And it's interesting you brought up the startup pitch decks, because there's, of course, this pitch deck framework that everyone knows. But a lot of times that actually starts with the problem. Mm-hmm. And what's different and what I think is really valuable that I do as well with startups is bringing in that situation. Because look, if it's like you're making another Uber or you're making another Airbnb, you don't have to describe the situation because everyone knows, what those businesses do. But if it's something medical, really, really specific, it's not enough to describe the problem because no one knows the tech. No one knows what you're talking about. So you kind of go one level higher. And if I would give you an example, I was working with a company making some measurement tools they go in your brain and they help with like Alzheimer's. And they had some innovation that the measurement tool has like a different way of measuring.
Okay,
and if you
very specific.
Very specific, right? And if you say that as like a problem with the previous one, people don't even know that you measure that way. So first introducing the situation like, hey, for Alzheimer's, there's a way to figure out how the patients are doing. And for that, we use these sensors. But the problem is they don't measure well enough because X, Y, Z. And we have this better solution. Yeah.
So you said it's very important to think about who will I talk to the audience and then figure out how to tell them the situation. So what kind of work do you do when you want to tell a story? Like, do you have any tricks for that?
Like preparation work for the audience. Yeah. So what I do with my clients oftentimes or in a training is we use something called an empathy map. Are you familiar with something like that? You might do it for sales, where you kind of construct a imaginary version of that person.
Okay. An avatar. Okay,
exactly. And sometimes you have a decision maker, so you would focus on that person. Sometimes it's a broader audience. Sometimes it could be the public. You have to just choose one typical person that it might be. And you would think about, let's say we're in a corporate environment, that's much easier, right? Because you've seen people go to the board and present. You can ask them how they did and what the CEO might have said, but you also know that there's company priorities. You know what they're interested in hearing, right? And you might know, the chief information officer might be asking about specific things. So you want to have those in your presentation. If it's a sales presentation, there's a different type of prep, which I'm sure you guys talk about in some of the podcasts, right? Kind of getting some intel, some information. And if you don't have that, then you got to think about the industry and what they do and what the typical problems might be. And you could talk about those. And of course, in a sales presentation, I would say it's a balance between stating those problems and actually asking what those problems might be. Right? So it's a little bit.
So
thank you.
This is a very interesting recipe. And I mean, I can see that, lots of people, they're not following them. And when you create a story through a presentation, yes, you're catching the attention. People in an easier way, they can remember it. But I would love to know your opinion. What do you think about anecdotes into the story? Are you recommending people to apply some anecdotes throughout the presentation and how to do them?
Okay, that's a very interesting question. It really, really depends on context and who you're speaking to. I have some clients in a corporate environment where the CEO is very, very tough. And sometimes they're not interested in anecdotes and they're interested just in you solving the problem. And that type of environment, I would not recommend it. On the other hand, in a sales environment or a environment where rapport is really important, then having those anecdotes is really powerful. And especially, if we talk about something else at the beginning, you build rapport, you relate it to the story. It's very powerful. What's really powerful as well are case studies, of course. And what's interesting for me about case studies is each case study is like a story in itself. So you have a mini story on one slide. And what I find a lot of people do or fail to do is to do this storytelling. They just drop a case study on there. Hey, we did this thing for this client. Or these are our references, right? But the story comes in the fact, what did you do that's special?
and how it started, right? The journey there.
Exactly. What the customer problem was, why they brought you on, what you solved, right? And I would say oftentimes we'll spend almost as much time on an individual case study as we will on a whole presentation, because it's really like just in that one case study you can sell your solution essentially.
And I believe those case studies, they don't need to be chosen randomly, right? So case study that it's very similar to the problem that the potential client is trying to tackle, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Because I've seen in the presentations, people hey, we work with, I don't know, big brands. They're just putting them there, just a big bunch of very well-known stuff. But, the use case doesn't solve the problem with the potential clients that I'm in. So this means it's not a good thing to use that kind of case studies.
Absolutely. That's a great point. So you could have one slide where you just list everyone you work with, and then you'd have to prepare. And this is the thing about these presentations. You got to put in the time to prepare. Sometimes what we do is make, 30 slides that has 10 case studies, and then they pull out the ones that they want, right? And then the sales deck should be max 10, to be honest, and maybe some backup. But that would...
we say that the sales deck in the end just supports, it doesn't sell. But what you said there is, it seems to me that a lot of companies don't grow because they tell dry stories to everyone. That cannot work. But what you are saying, the magic is in the preparation, specifically to the audience, in their words, in a structure that helps them. And very few do this preparation that you outlined.
Right. So yeah, that's an important point. And I think that look, if you have the best sales guy in the world and he knows the client personally, probably don't need a sales deck, right?
Yes.
Yeah. But if you're going to have some uncertainties, answer some questions, you have maybe a sales guy that's good, but unfamiliar with the client, the presentation is really a powerful tool. It helps them guide the audience. The audience shouldn't be reading the slides. It's really a support tool, but it can also be used as a send ahead or send after. And it really supports a really powerful presentation.
I think, and sales is about trust, rapport. You said, if I talk to you and you get a good feeling, if I then send a presentation that tells the story that relates to you, I demonstrate that I understand you. If I send you, off-the-shelf presentation just with the dry facts, that momentum to even establish better rapport is not generated. It's just a dry presentation. The conversation felt so awesome. You're not taking advantage of the momentum.
That's a great point, Alex. And what I was thinking about is that a lot of people will then assume that it's so much work to create a really good presentation afterwards. And I think that the differentiator, or what I would like to point out there, is that the amount of work actually goes into just the first few slides. You can still have all the solution stuff in detail, but where you relate to the audience comes in the first 3 slides. So if you can prepare that as a follow-up, you spend a little bit of time on that makes a huge difference. And then you can drop in the other 7 or the standardized stuff, because it just falls in to the flow.
Yeah. And for the past couple of minutes, we've discussed about storytelling, the importance of storytelling, and even you shared a recipe with the audience, how to create such a presentation, but how they can practice telling a story. Because I've seen excellent presentations. I could have imagined the story behind it, but then the presenter was not able to tell the story.
Yeah, that's absolutely a challenge. And especially for introverts like myself and like many of us. And you and I have discussed this in the past, that introverts can make really good presenters. So what I think is really powerful is the deck itself. That gets them the foundation, right? And it's something they can rely on to a certain extent. What I found especially for introverts, is their passion for something is what really makes them comfortable in the room. I'm personally passionate about storytelling and PowerPoint. It makes me more comfortable to talk about the topic, right? And so the practice there comes in just being super comfortable with the material itself. Because then when you have the extrovert on the other side and he or she is asking you questions and shooting at the different points, you can kind of orient yourself through the presentation. And because you know the topic so deeply, and I would say not only knowledge of the topic, but it's kind of like if you forgive me for this word, like a love for the topic, like a passion and excitement for it, it's much more difficult for them to throw you off in that sense. So I wouldn't call that a practice. It's kind of like like an individual practicing. It's more like a long-term practice, like being in love, being passionate about the work you do, and then you carry that over to the presentations. However, for like practical tips, sure, there's, different tips on the internet and such. I don't apply those so much for the introverts because those tips are often like, hey, be more confident. You're going to get the confidence from the passion, to be honest. And that's where it's going to come in.
That's a funny tip. Just be more confident, then you're going to close deals. Just, it's so easy.
So my favorite one is, don't let the audience interrupt you. Tell them to wait till the end. I say, try that in a boardroom. You're going to get kicked out in 2 seconds.
Excellent. But a presentation without visuals, it's not a good presentation, right? If you agree. And tell me about the role about the visuals, how they can support a storytelling presentation.
Okay, that's a great question. And I would just make a quick comment around the types of presentations, because on the internet and YouTube and things, you find these I would say guidelines on how to make a presentation and have only a few words and no detail and lots of visuals and lots of pictures. And then you're working on some IT integration project and you have like super detailed graphs and things like that. And you struggle to merge those two worlds. And the reason why is because there's essentially like two different worlds. So there's a presentation that you give live on stage, and then the presentation where it's a document. And in these corporate environments, they actually read the slides ahead of time. So that's actually best practice, so that you send it ahead, they read it, and you get to the room and they're discussing it. So you still have that detail, but no one's reading the slides in the moment. Or if they are, they're reading it on their paper in front of them. And then the sales presentation is somewhere in between, where you need a bit of detail, but you also don't want people reading it in the room. Maybe a little bit. You could use animations or something like that, right? Nevertheless, the visuals make a huge difference, right? And even in the document, there's a reason why you're using slides and not sending a piece of paper, right? So Amazon does that document thing because they weren't using slides correctly, in fact. So they just said, oh, we're not going to use slides. And in fact, I've heard they actually use slides. So it's a little bit tricky there. So the idea is that you want to design so that the content is more digestible. You want to design so that people can take away the content and remember it more easily than a block of text. So it could be something as simple as just highlighting keywords. That's already like use of visuals in a way. Or it's choosing the right form of a graph or a table based on the audience or based on the data. Or it's not putting 6 graphs on one slide, which some of my clients do, right? And like stacked bar graphs with like percentages on top. And, you don't want to overwhelm the audience. You want to focus on one message per slide, one core message. Then you can have something below, right? But each slide in itself, just like the case study, is like a mini story, and then together they make the overall story. One element of design is it is a reading document using the headlines to tell the story. So it's self-explanatory. So many people miss this, right? They put in a graph and they just write financials, and the audience has to think. You actually don't want them to think. This is the trick. Or not have to think about what you're trying to say. Then they can think about whether, they agree with it or not, or if it makes sense. The less they have to think, the more they start to trust in a way, right? And then other visuals we might use are like frameworks, things like that, structuring the content in a way. if it is a reading deck for corporate, I never use pictures, like actual photos, unless they would add an extreme amount of value. In a sales presentation, I've also not seen photos. Someone will use like a space shuttle or something like that. Visuals can evoke emotion, but if it's not directly related to the content, it's just very distracting. So there, use it in a keynote. You have a few words, then you have some pictures, and again, the picture selection, that is an art in itself, because it's like you want to get the message across of like empathy. So you type in empathy to the stock picture portfolio. It doesn't give you an image of empathy. So it's that becomes a little bit of an art to choose that image. So I think last time we used something like a child jumping into the arms of his father, some kind of like, that's not even empathy. That's more like support. It's there's really a kind of art to that piece, and I would say it's not so common in a lot of work I'm doing.
So let me try to tell you a story, and you tell me how to improve it.
Okay.
I'm going to be short because have you ever heard about that game Bullshit Hero?
No.
I was at a conference not so long ago. There were 300 people in the audience, and I had to present on a random topic in front of the audience. The topic, I don't want to say what it was, but it was something very dirty, and there were 300 business people looking at me, and I had to present for 3 minutes, and there were random pictures thrown in. Terrible pictures, terrible graphs, and I had to tell the story, and it was so difficult because the story, the subject was embarrassing. I didn't know the audience, and of course, what you just said about how to design a good PowerPoint, that was not a good PowerPoint. There was a picture of Putin coming up, and then some little cute animal, and then a graph from the World Bank that I didn't understand, and it was terrifying.
And why did they do that to you?
Oh, it's a game, so it's an icebreaker at the conference, this Bullshit Hero game. In Czech, sprdele slajdy, they call it. Sorry.
Okay, but that actually sounds like a really fun thing that would be a good icebreaker, maybe.
Yes, maybe.
Maybe. But you didn't have control of the PowerPoint then?
No.
Yeah. So that makes it definitely difficult. I would say that, okay, and we weren't talking about the exact subject. So if you can relate the subject to the audience and you make it funny, I think that's all you can really do in that type of situation, because I don't see like it's not a presentation for an outcome per se. Well, the outcome is to make people laugh and relax, right?
Yes, exactly.
So then that would be the goal.
They said you have to really improvise and go with a story, and the first idea you catch, just continue, and either the picture on the wall supports you or not. But then again, I told a little story. How can I do better next time to tell this story from your expert view?
I've never been in that situation, to be honest, of such
Oh, no, what I mean, I told you the story of this experience.
Oh, you want me to tell you the story of the experience?
How could I improve that? I related that story to you, what happened to me. So I thought you'd give me some feedback on my storytelling.
On your storytelling of the story. I thought you meant of the presentation. I think the idea, you told me about the bullshit thing. So then going back and explaining a little bit more about the context would have helped me understand, because I was trying to ask you questions about it. You would have told me there's this icebreaker thing that I used, or I went to some conference, right? And they have this icebreaker concept called bullshit stories, where it's variable content and you get lost easily or whatever you're telling me, and then tell your part of it and how you did.
So describe the situation that I was in by the parameters, and then tell you, and it was terrible, and this is how I did. It would be easier for you.
It would be easier
thank
for
you.
me. So.
I learned something.
Yeah.
Thank you.
But this is exactly, throughout this discussion with Jan, story. We all grew up with stories, right? And every story starts with a situation, right? Once upon a time, there was a king living in such a place, That place was, surrounded by nice trees. And in the castle, there was a woman.
Set the scene.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah, that's exactly it. Yeah.
So that's the story. So
Yeah.
what you said, like your story, and what Jan says, like it's exactly like once upon a time I was in a conference where, you know...
It's just you have to do it faster.
Exactly.
That's the only thing, right?
I was at a conference with 300 business people. They were playing a game called Bullshit Hero. The game is they throw random pictures on the wall and you have to, for 3 minutes, present to a subject that you have not been familiarized with before, and it's uncomfortable and personal.
Yeah.
And I was in that situation. Would that be better?
Yeah, that's better.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, it's better for me.
So, excellent. Jan, thanks a lot for this very nice and meaningful conversation. I've learned a lot. I believe Alex also did learn, and I believe this will be a great inspiration for our audience. And for the final thing, like, what are your final thoughts? What would you love to share with, let's say, with the founders, co-founders, CEOs, and salespeople in this world when they do the presentations?
I would say absolutely don't underestimate the power of the slides themselves. They sometimes carry a weight that's greater than you would expect. In a sales context, especially if you're sending something ahead or after the sales pitch, in a corporate context, they are sometimes more important than the speaker, to be honest, because the problem they're solving is kind of more important than the individual person, let's say. And at the same time, slides, because they're built with logic, they are in a way a synthesis of your thinking. So they show the audience that you know how to think in a logical, structured manner, and it builds trust. And in a sales environment, you might not have so many opportunities to do that. But in a corporate environment, when you're repeating those presentations many times, people start to see you as someone they can trust, and then they trust you can deliver.
Thank you very much, Jan.
Thank you very much, Jan.
Thank you, guys.
Tohle byl náš rozhovor s Janem Pochopem, expertem na storytelling, a co si z toho odnesete a co já si z toho odnáším, že bez příběhu to nejde. Příběh buduje důvěru a příběh dá práci, ale vždycky se to vyplatí. Pokud chcete víc vědět o tom, jak dobře využívat PowerPoint, jak si příběh a storytelling jako dovednost osvojit, navštivte a najděte Jana Pochopa na LinkedInu. Chystá do budoucna pravidelný webinář, kde vás naučí víc o storytelling. Díky za poslech.
Děkujeme, že jste si poslechli další díl podcastu Saleshero. Aby vám žádný díl neunikl, dejte prosím follow na Spotify a Apple Podcasts. Budeme rádi za zpětnou vazbu. Můžete nás kontaktovat přes LinkedIn nebo naši webovou stránku www.saleshero.cz. Těšíme se příště na slyšenou nebo na viděnou.